Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The Vatican has many doors that remain locked not for security, but for silence. Inside those quiet spaces, beneath frescoes, behind aged oak cabinets, and beneath the long marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace, there exist collections that very few are allowed to touch. Some are forgotten, others are protected. A few, however, are hidden for reasons that are not fully explained, even to those who guard them. Among these was once a single scroll, no more than 10 inches across when rolled, bound in a cord of linen, dyed with iron gall ink, and sealed not with wax, but with lead. That alone was unusual. Wax was soft, ceremonial. Lead was something else, durable, permanent, less a signal of holiness, and more a declaration that this was never to be opened by accident. It was labeled simply Mandatum sub Oculi Pontificis, directive to be read under the eyes of the Pope. The scroll was dated 1210, the name on the outside, Quist Sentius III. Pope Innocent III was not a passive man. He did not write letters to forget them. He had already crowned kings and deposed emperors. He had convened the Fourth Lateran Council and defined the very grammar of papal supremacy. So why would he compose a document and bind it so tightly, then hide it within the inner workings of the Vatican? And why would he specify that only a pope and no one else should be allowed to read it? To begin to understand that question, we must go back not to 1210, but earlier, to a time when papal authority was not yet centralized, when the Church still shared some of its rituals with older Roman customs, and when scrolls rather than books were still the favorite medium for communicating what was never meant to be public. By the late 12th century, the Vatican's record-keeping was evolving. Monks kept scriptoriums, yes, but the papal chancery, essentially the Pope's writing office, had grown complex. Not everything written in Latin was destined for a cathedral or kingdom. Many letters were sent internally. Some were copied into registers. Others vanished into drawers. The scroll in question, historians believe, was created at a time of deep internal conflict within the Church. Pope Innocent III had just authorized the Albigensian Crusade, calling on the lords of France to eradicate the Cathar heresy in the south. The decision was not universally applauded. Many saw it as a spiritual war gone political, more about land than doctrine. But something else was brewing. Inside the papal curia, that tight circle of secretaries, cardinals, and advisors, rumors circulated that Innocent had received word of a troubling discovery, not from France, but from further east, from a group of Cistercian monks traveling through Dalmatia and the Balkans. The letter they sent back to Rome, now lost, allegedly described the contents of a monastery that had been buried after an earthquake. In the rubble, the monks had discovered a scroll much older, one written in Greek and Latin. Its script was unusual. Some called it heretical, others prophetic. The scroll referenced an unnamed successor to Peter, who would be given a crown and blinded by its light. It described a time when those who held keys would forget what they opened, and when one would read a thing and never speak it again. To most clerics, this would have been obscure mysticism, but Innocent was not most clerics. He had studied law and Bolognian theology in Paris. He was a logician, trained to detect danger, not in open threats, but in implications. He ordered the original document brought to Rome under secrecy. According to a later Vatican inventory from 1298, it was placed in a sealed box inside the papal library and marked examinandus non communicandus, to be studied, not to be shared, close in parenthesis. No other pope ever referred to it again, but something about it clearly struck Innocent, because sometime shortly after, he wrote his own scroll, the one with the lead seal. We do not know what it said. We only know where it was placed, in a carved cavity behind the shelf of the Vatican's secretum, section of the Apostolic Library, restricted even from the College of Cardinals. The slot was designed to hold exactly one scroll. It was discovered centuries later during the 1947 reorganization of the papal archives, but by then, Teo had been damaged, not broken, but bent. Someone, at some point, had tried to open it. The investigation into the scroll's history that followed unearthed something even stranger. Multiple references in church correspondence to a silent document of warning. One 5th century entry, written in the margin of a letter from Pope Paul II's librarian, reads, "There is a thing in the wall that no one reads, but it changes the air in the room." That was all. Another note, dated 1620, from an archivist named Camillo Borghese, no relation to the Pope of the same name, suggested that Pope Gregory XV had ordered the scroll sealed in eternity and requested that any who found it record only its place, not its voice. What was it that Pope Innocent III feared? Why write a letter that only a pope could read? Why bind it in lead, store it in a carved cavity, and make no copies? And what did the earlier scroll say, one uncovered in the rubble, that might have inspired such secrecy? Historians disagree. Some believe Innocent was issuing a doctrinal warning, that he foresaw schisms, false claimants to the throne of Peter, or even a spiritual crisis that could not be addressed in his own time. Others suspect the scroll had nothing to do with prophecy at all, but was instead a legal directive regarding church property, financial mismanagement, or a confession tied to one of the internal trials of the papal court. But then, there's one final theory, a stranger one, that the scroll was never meant to be read aloud, because it contained not doctrine or danger but doubt. Pope Innocent, after all, had more authority than any pope before him. He had reshaped the role of the papacy, placing himself between God and kings. He had excommunicated emperors, defiant orthodoxy, called crusades. But what if, in private, he questioned what he had built? What if he had seen something in that earlier Greek scrawls, something ambiguous, metaphorical, that stirred a concern too dangerous to voice? And what if his own scroll was a confession, not of sin, but of uncertainty? We cannot know. The scroll remains sealed today. Its lead binding has been reinforced, its placement catalogued, its existence acknowledged, but never explained. Only a sitting pope has the authority to unseal it. So far, none have. And so the question remains, what is written in the scroll that only the pope can read? And why has no one dared? The Vatican, as you may already sense, is not merely a place of prayer, pageantry, and papal audiences. It is also a fortress of memory beneath the Baroque domes, behind the frescoed ceilings, and below the marble floors lie corridors where memory is kept, not lived, not celebrated, but catalogued. That is where the scroll remained, not in the Sistine Chapel, not in St. Peter's Basilica, but in the Vatican archives, officially named the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum. This repository holds centuries of papal documents, letters, account books, treaties, trials, and censures. Nearly 53 miles of shelving, hidden beneath the papal palace. But contrary to popular imagination, the word secretum does not mean secret in the modern conspiratorial sense. It means private, as in the personal archive of the Pope. And yet, there is something undeniably secretive about it. Diet. Humidity is regulated, the temperature controlled. The permission to enter restricted to approved scholars, vetted, catalogued, and limited. You may request a document, but you cannot browse. You may study a folio, but not the folder it came from, and some entries simply marked with abbreviations. Dates or Latin codes are never available at all. One such code is MSOP 1210 N1. That is the designation given to Pope Innocent III's sealed scroll. It appears in the catalog only 3 times, once in a handwritten text dated 1701, once in a typed, restricted index compiled during Pope Leo XIII's reorganization of the archives in 1881, and once in 1965, when it was marked as permanently restricted with the note Praetor Pontificum Nemo Legendum. No one but the Pope may read it. This poses a peculiar contradiction. If the document is so important that it must be protected for centuries, why should no pope feel compelled to open it? Why preserve what one refuses to read? To understand this, one must step into the rhythms of the church, not the visible ones, like masses and feast days, but the hidden rhythms of silence, delay, and institutional memory. For the church, time is not urgent, it is recursive. A pope does not need to act on a scroll simply because it exists. Scroll can wait 800 years if necessary, and, in fact, some historians believe this is exactly the logic behind the document's continued existence, not as a call to action, but as a long, echoing, ancient voice intended for a moment not yet arrived. But what sort of moment would that be? Let us go deeper. During the 14th century, a man named Bartolomeo Platina, an Italian humanist and the first Vatican librarian, began to systematize the Vatican's records. Though born a century after Pope Innocent III, he left behind notes about various sealed mandates that had no decipherable purpose. In his margin, he scribbled, "Some instructions are not for action. They are for recognition," hence, at something subtle, that within the Vatican, certain messages are preserved not for what they cause, but for what they confirm. They serve not as warnings to be acted upon, but as mile markers designed to resonate only when a particular pattern is recognized. Like a code, you cannot decipher until you've seen it twice. So perhaps the scroll contains a description of a future moment, a convergence of symbols, a pattern of behavior, a confluence of church and state, or heresy and power, that, when repeated, would finally warrant the scroll's opening. If this sounds overly poetic, consider that the Vatican itself was built atop such patterns when Pope Julius II began the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in the early 1500s. He wasn't building atop empty land, he was building atop a necropolis, a Roman burial site predating Christianity. Beneath St. Peter's tomb lie older graves, pagan ones, and even those older still. The church did not see this as an obstacle. It saw it as continuity, the past buried beneath the present, and layers of meaning, nothing erased, only absorbed. The same logic applies to the archives. In 1999, Italian paleographer named Lucia Capaldi, while reviewing restricted files related to medieval inquisitions, stumbled across a footnote in a 14th century codex. It referred to the hidden instruction of the blind keys. She could not determine the exact meaning, but the phrase is haunting. Blind keys. Perhaps a reference to papal authority, unable to see what it unlocks. When she cross-referenced the phrase, it only appeared once more in an anonymous commentary on Pope Innocent III's handling of the 1215 Lateran Council. The commentary suggested that Innocent's bold claims about transubstantiation, papal supremacy, and clerical reform may have been followed by a private admission of the dangers those claims unleashed. One passage reads, "He placed the lock on the door and warned that one day even the lock would forget why it was made." If the scroll is that warning, then it is not just a message. It is a mirror waiting for someone to notice that the church has become what it once feared. The machinery of the papacy of control, ritual, and obedience has drifted from its source. But again, this is interpretation. The truth lies hidden in the binding dot. It's worth noting that throughout history, other popes have had access to the scroll and chosen not to read it. Leo X during the Reformation, Pius IX during the loss of the Papal States, Paul VI during Vatican II. Each faced turmoil. Each might have had reason to break the seal, yet none did. Why? A former Vatican archivist, now anonymous, once wrote, "The knowledge of unread power is itself a form of discipline." The scroll may not contain a solution. It may only contain a truth. And truth, in some circumstances, is more dangerous than ignorance. We live in an age of rapid revelation. Documents are leaked, archives digitized, secrets whispered through cables and cables undone by algorithms. Yet the scroll persists, digitized, untouched, and unknown, and still waiting. There is an interesting epilogue to this phase of the scroll's history. In 2013, the newly elected Pope Francis, a Jesuit known for his simplicity and sharp memory, was given the standard private orientation to the papal archives. Every new pope is shown the location of key vaults and instructed on their privileges, including the right to read MSOP 1210 in one dot. According to an unnamed cardinal who later spoke to an Italian journalist under condition of anonymity, Francis was told of the scroll, shown its physical placement behind a sealed brass gate, and offered the chance to open it. He declined. When asked why, he reportedly smiled and said, "Some things are better left to time." And so it remains there, sealed, slipped between metal brackets, the linen tie now fragile, the lead seal darkened by age. Some believe the scroll should never be opened, not because of what it contains, but because of what it represents. The possibility that even the papacy, the very apex of earthly spiritual authority, once paused, doubted, feared, or foresaw its own future as something needing to be warned against. Others believe it's simply a curiosity, an undeciphered note about administration or politics, or perhaps nothing at all. But if that were true, wouldn't one pope just, one in 800 years, have risked opening it? Instead, the scroll sits where few walk, in a chamber few speak of, with a message no one can quote. And so the question grows louder in its silence. What memory does the Church fear so deeply that it has chosen to protect it from even itself? Let us now return to the beginning not of the scroll itself, but of the moment it was most likely written. The year was 1213. Pope Innocent III, arguably the most powerful and doctrinally aggressive pontiff of the medieval era, had already convened the Fourth Lateran Council. He had excommunicated kings, initiated crusades, redefined the Eucharist, and expanded the very concept of papal supremacy. Europe bowed to his decrees. Even kings listened, some reluctantly, some out of necessity. But somewhere in that year, something happened that didn't make it into the public annals. A private audience, a troubling confession, a vision, a conversation not meant for records, and from that silence emerged the scroll. The Vatican has never released the scroll's text, but we know from peripheral documents and passing references in archival ledgers that it was sealed with lead, written in Latin on lambskin parchment, and kept in a cylindrical case likely carved from cypress wood, a tree long associated with death and preservation. The seal bore not the papal ring, but a lesser-used emblem, known only from a handful of ceremonial edicts, the signum crucis vesperatha, sign of the evening cross, a symbol rarely used and only during periods of dusk prayer, or when pronouncements were too sensitive to be revealed publicly. The question, then, is not just what the scroll contains, but why it required such a symbol. Some believe the scroll speaks not of politics or heresy, but of succession, not simply of who follows whom, but of how the Church might one day find itself ruled by a power it cannot contain a future pontiff, perhaps not aligned with the teachings of Christ, but with political forces that would use the church as a shield. This theory is supported by a cryptic passage in a 13th century codex from the Abbey of Monte Cassino. The monk who copied the manuscript included a marginal note that read, "Beware the man who wears Peter's ring but carries Caesar's tongue." A warning, perhaps, not about heresy in the traditional sense, but about a fusion of temporal and spiritual power so seamless that even the faithful could not tell the difference. Still, others believe the scroll relates to a specific vision, possibly a dream, possibly a mystical episode experienced by Pope Innocent himself. According to a late 13th century source, Liber Collectionarum Secretorum is preserved in fragments in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence. The Pope once awoke in the middle of the night, trembling, claiming he had seen a procession of men in red garments, faces hidden, walking backwards through the basilica. He reportedly wrote down what he saw. That scroll, the source speculated, was sealed not because it was dangerous, but because it was inexplicable. We will never know whether that is true, but what is undeniable is that the scroll became known among archivists, among a few trusted Jesuits, among the fringe community of medievalists who specialize in Vaticana obscura not by its content, but by its presence. It has become something like a placeholder for doubt, a footnote to the idea of infallibility, because if the Pope were truly certain of his divine mandate, why would there be a document he dare not read? Some modern scholars have argued that this is precisely why the scroll remains sealed, because to open it would be to expose the papacy to the very doubted. Tries to avoid. In 1983, during the pontificate of John Paul II, a small but historic shift occurred. The Vatican Secret Archive was partially opened to qualified scholars, offering access to documents up through the end of the papacy of Pope Leo XIII, 1903. For the first time, the world's historians were able to see firsthand the back and forth of councils, communications, secret trials, and the real bureaucratic life of the medieval church, but not the scroll. When asked about it by French historian Jacques Le Goff, a senior official reportedly replied, "Some things are older than the archive, and there lies the hidden tension, because the scroll was never meant for history, it was meant for recognition." That is the word that recurs again and again in obscure Vatican memoranda when the scroll is referenced. Cognitio, not in the sense of acknowledgement, but of pattern recognition. A 17th century Vatican librarian named Gregorio Neri made a cryptic remark in one of his handwritten indexes. That which is written for the eye may remain sealed until the mirror returns its shape. It is a confusing phrase, but it appears that even he understood the scroll's role not as a command, but a reflection, a trigger that would only activate once the world looked. It's familiar enough to what was described inside. And that's where things become uncomfortable, because in recent years, many within and beyond the church have noticed similarities, subtle echoes between present circumstances and what little is known about the scroll's purpose. For example, an internal Vatican report from 2018 noted a resurgence in the influence of politicized theology within the ranks of church hierarchy, where bishops, cardinals, and even entire conferences began aligning less with doctrine and more with ideology. Publicly, this was discussed in terms of church unity. Privately, some officials began whispering, "Has the time come?" Even more startling, a Jesuit priest, well known for his discretion, wrote a private commentary that was never published but circulated among a handful of academics. It included the following line: "The scroll exists not to warn the world, but to warn the church, that it might one day forget its own voice." If this is true, the scroll is a warning about forgetting, about confusion between authority and obedience, between ritual and purpose. Then its silence is not accidental. it is protective. And yet, what if the world has already crossed the threshold the scroll describes? What if the church has already become what the scroll feared? This is the thought that keeps resurfacing among a very small group of theologians and historians. They not say it loudly, they do not publish it, but they speak of a threshold pattern already fulfilled. One such scholar, whom we'll call Paulo, told an interviewer off the record, "We used to think the scroll warned of something ahead, but now I wonder if it isn't meant for us. For right now, it's perhaps we are too late. There is no proof, no transcription, no leak, only the quiet presence of a sealed tube, and yet, across centuries, it has cast a shadow longer than any document in PayPal history." There are, of course, more practical theories. Some believe the scroll contains not a prophecy, but a confession, perhaps, of doubt, or political compromise, or a spiritual fear harbored even by Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff of the medieval world. Others think it is a theological thesis so radical that it could unravel centuries of assumed truth, and still others believe it is none of those things. It's just an elaborate placeholder, an artifact of legend. But then, why preserve it so carefully? Why not quietly destroy it and remove the burden altogether? Because, perhaps, the scroll is no longer just a message. It is a test, not of knowledge, but of humility. It dares the church to live with the possibility that there exists a truth so sharp, so unsparing, that even the strongest institution on earth fears to see it written in ink. And in that, fear paradoxically becomes holy, because not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be carried. So the scroll remains in its chamber, somewhere beneath the apostolic palace. You could walk past it, feet above it, unknowing. Priests pass near it on their way to morning liturgy. Visitors take guided tours of adjacent galleries. Tourists snap pictures of ceilings painted by Raphael, unaware that just meters away sits a forgotten breath of the past trapped in parchment, sealed in wax, breathing only through rumor. And every few decades, a new pope is led to the gate, told of its existence, offered the key, and everyone, so far, has walked away. The door never opens, but the question does. You might not remember the name Father Giuseppe Valteri. Few people do. He was never a cardinal. He never presided over any council. He didn't author any major treatises or discover buried texts. But for over 41 years, he had a key to a door few people in the world even know exists, and fewer still are allowed to walk through in the early 20th century. Long before the Vatican's secret archives became partially accessible to select scholars, they were managed by a handful of men, all clergy, all silent, all sworn not to speak of what they handled. The archives, properly named the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum, were vast, rows upon rows of bound manuscripts, papal bulls, medieval edicts, ledgers, private letters, excommunication papers, and even coded notes passed between popes and emperors. But there was one room inside the archives that had no label on the door. Its lock required 2 keys, one of which was held by the archivist-in-chief. The other was held in the papal chamberlain's vault. Together, they could open a narrow wooden door lined with iron. Behind that, a hallway with no windows. Then another door, this one with a Latin inscription carved above it. See Tasius, Libro Bearis. If you remain silent, you will be set free. It was in this room that the document known only as Liber Non Existentiae, the Book of Non-Existence, was kept. Its existence was never formally acknowledged. In fact, it was only referenced in internal index cards under a code that read simply LXC9V. Even most archivists didn't know what it meant, but Father Giuseppe did. He had been shown the document as a young cleric during his training, not to read it, but to know where it was, how to protect it, and what to do if ever the order came to destroy it. That was the part that stayed with him for decades. Not that it had to be read, but that one day it might have to be burned, and that burning it would not be a symbolic act. It would be final. It would mean erasing a thought from the historical record, not an error or a forgery, but an idea so dangerous that its continued existence, even unread, is considered a threat to the unity of the church. No one told him what it said. They didn't need to. It was handwritten, early medieval Latin, faded ink on calfskin vellum. And on the outer margin, near the edge of the binding, was a single word in red. Tas. Be silent. Father Giuseppe had seen countless secrets in his time. Maps of places that no longer existed. Ink-smudged letters from inquisitors. Trial transcripts of people whose fates were never recorded. But nothing weighed on him like that. One book. He didn't speak of it for years. He became a fixture in the archives, rarely leaving Rome. He was known for his long hours, his quiet manner, and his unusually meticulous calligraphy when transcribing old documents. He drank bitter coffee from the same ceramic cup each morning and walked the same path between the basilica and his dormitory every evening, humming the same hymn under his breath. But then came the year 1951. The Second World War had ended 6 years earlier. The church was grappling with new political tensions, Cold War alliances, the rise of communism in Eastern Europe. There was a growing concern, not openly discussed, but quietly feared, that elements of the church had collaborated with regimes it should have condemned. Whispers circulated in diplomatic corridors that some documents in the archives could raise uncomfortable questions about wartime neutrality, hidden sympathies, or worse. It was in this atmosphere of unease that an envelope arrived at Father Giuseppe's office. It was sealed in wax, stamped with the signum consilium papali, the seal used only for internal correspondence related to papal instructions. Inside was a handwritten note, short, formal. It simply said, "Prepare LXC9V for incineration. Date and time to follow." No record to remain. No explanation. No discussion. He stared at the note for hours that night, unlocked the outer corridor, using his key, and waited for the Chamberlain's courier to arrive with the second. Together, they entered the vault. They removed the Book of Non-Existence from its resting place. They placed it inside a sealed case, the kind designed to withstand heat, as to protect the surrounding materials during destruction. Then, Father Giuseppe took it home. That was not part of the instructions, but he told himself it was temporary. He just needed to think, to decide whether he could, in good conscience, light the flame. He placed the book in his drawer, sat beside it for hours. Then he walked the streets of Rome until dawn, passing churches that stood locked in shadow, their bells silent. He remembered his oath, his training, but he also remembered something his mentor once said to him when he was first shown the book. "We are not guards," the old priest had whispered. "We are witnesses. A witness does not destroy. A witness remembers." The next morning, he returned the book to the archives, but not before he did something unexpected. He made a note in the archival index. Just one word. Tacitum. It meant simply kept silent. He then returned the destruction notice to the Vatican courier with a brief reply. Document LXC9V no longer available. File empty. Its contents untraceable. That was all. He never explained, and the matter was never followed up. Perhaps because someone knew what he had done and silently agreed, or perhaps because in the bureaucratic machinery of the church, even powerful directives sometimes fell through the cracks of inertia and ambiguity. Either way, the book survived. Years later, long after his retirement, Father Giuseppe wrote a private journal. It was never published. Fragments of it were found among his papers after his death in 1982. In it, He reflected on what he called the burden of unburned truth. We are taught to destroy heresy, he wrote. But what if it is not heresy? What if it is only possibility? To destroy it is to erase the capacity to imagine, and a church that cannot imagine cannot forgive. He never revealed the book's content, only that it contained a view of the faith not aligned with orthodoxy, but not hostile to it either. It was not a denial of belief, he said, but a whisper from its margins. Some now speculate it contained writings from early desert mystics, those elusive first-century Christians whose gospels were excluded from the canon, whose visions did not conform to the structures of empire. Others think it was a record of a council that never took place, a dialogue that once occurred between East and West, between orthodoxy and heresy, and was buried not because it was dangerous, but because it asked the church to pause, to listen, to consider. The flame never came, and so the book waited. It may still wait beneath marble, iron, and frescoes, perhaps sealed behind a shelf mislabeled in Latin, perhaps in a box marked damaged, awaiting restoration. Or perhaps it was moved again by someone else who understood what Giuseppe did, that silence can be a form of mercy. And preservation is not always endorsement. No one knows for sure, but among archivists, a new phrase now circulates quietly, almost like a benediction: Giuseppe's refusal. It refers not just to the act of disobedience, but to a deeper, quieter courage, the refusal to destroy something simply because it did not fit, did not follow, did not conform. A refusal to burn what history might one day need. There is a peculiar kind of silence that fills archives. It's not merely the absence of noise, but a cultivated hush, as if the walls themselves have agreed not to speak. Dust accumulates, not just on old parchment, but on the gaps in time that no one dares disturb. And within the Vatican's secret archives, silence is more than a condition. It's a protocol. After Father Giuseppe Valteri refused to destroy the mysterious document LXC 9V, the implications of his decision began to ripple, not outward through the world, but inward, into the cryptic rhythms of the archive itself. You might imagine that defiance would come with consequences, perhaps an inquest, a dismissal, or at least a confrontation, but none came. No questions were asked. The silence that surrounded the book simply expanded to include the silence around its non-destruction. And that's when Giuseppe began to suspect something. He might not have been the first one to refuse. The archives are a place of order, also of patterns, small, subtle deviations in handwriting, changes in labeling customs, shelves slightly misaligned from the rest. These details don't speak loudly, but they whisper, especially to those who spent decades listening, in a dark back corridor of what was once part of the 17th century extension, a part of the archives few ever visited. Giuseppe began cross-referencing a series of inventory cards from the reign of Pope Clement VIII. Most were routine copies of land charters, doctrinal decrees, and old heresies, censored books. But one card stood out, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. It had been filed under a code, LVX143R, DATED 1602. The description box simply read, confiscated, awaiting decision. No title, no author, no subject category. The notes column bore just a single word in faded brown ink: tacitum. The same word Giuseppe had used 3 centuries later. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence. But a few days later, he found another, this one from 1734, marked under the pontificate of Pope Clement XII. Again, it bore no title. Again, it included no identifying text. But in the lower left corner of the index, once more, tacitum, 3 entries. 3 centuries. Same word and the same fate. Not read, not destroyed, just left alone. What began to emerge was not a conspiracy, but a pattern, a quiet lineage of refusals, each archivist passing down their silence as an unspoken inheritance. Giuseppe had not invented mercy. He had joined it. But what were these documents? Why were they always labeled vaguely, stored cryptically, and never quite destroyed? To understand that, you need to know something about how the church has handled ideas that don't fit historically. There were 3 main options: anathematize them, condemn them publicly, brand them heretical, and order their destruction. Absorb them, copy their language, baptize their insights into orthodoxy, and repackage them as revelations. Silence them. Do not respond. Do not destroy. File them away and never mention them again. The first method was common in the age of inquisitions. The second occurred with pagan philosophy. Aristotle found his way into Thomas Aquinas' reasoning, not by chance, by deliberate appropriation. But the third, the silent shelving, was far rarer. It was used for documents that neither threatened nor could be easily digested. They didn't attack doctrine, nor could they be assimilated. They were strange, gentle, possibly true, and totally unmanageable. Father Giuseppe came to believe LXC9V fell into that third category. He began referring to it privately, never aloud, only in his notes, as scriptura silence. The silent scripture. Though he never recorded its contents, he left behind clues, phrases scattered in the margins of his journals, paraphrases of arguments made by unnamed voices. One particularly cryptic line read, "It was said that grace is not given from above, but drawn from within, that the kingdom is not waited for, but remembered, and that God, before becoming a father, was first a memory." Such language doesn't fit comfortably into orthodoxy. It neither denies divinity nor asserts heresy. It simply repositions the entire landscape of faith. Inward, backward, downward was this ancient Gnosticism, mystical allegory, a proto-psychological theology, or something else entirely. Giuseppe began to suspect that the book he was asked to destroy wasn't just dangerous because of what it said, but because of who had written it. You see, marginal voices are only dangerous to institutions when they come from inside the institution. If a heretic writes a scroll, you burn it. If a pope writes it, you hide it. There is an obscure tradition, rarely spoken of, about writings attributed to certain early pontiffs that were never canonized, never quoted, and never discussed. These weren't false or disqualified texts. They were inconvenient, offering insights or spiritual frameworks that couldn't be resolved by the later machinery of church politics. Giuseppe began to wonder if LXC9V was one of them. A PayPal meditation, perhaps. A letter never sent. A vision recorded in a moment of crisis and then quickly buried when consensus proved impossible. But there was no way to confirm this. No signature. No PayPal bull. Only silence. And yet, the more Giuseppe studied the other Tacitum entries, the more he realized how many clerics over the centuries had reached the same conclusion: to let the scrolls sleep. One account, from the early 1800s, referenced a letter found in the archives addressed to the beloved one, whose face remains unseen. It described the Mass not as a reenactment of sacrifice, but as a remembrance of wholeness, a returning, not a plea. Again, borderline mystical, not heretical, but certainly disruptive. Another scroll, never opened since the 15th century, bore an ink drawing on the front cover, a fish upside down, surrounded by a circle of thorns. No text, no context, it's just a symbol, marked as Tacitum. What could be so dangerous about symbols? Perhaps nothing, or perhaps in an institution built on order. Symbols that bypass doctrine and speak directly to intuition are seen as too potent. The church is not. After all, just a house of prayer. It is a system of memory. And systems do not handle ambiguity well. By the end of his life, Giuseppe had cataloged 27 such entries, all marked in one way or another with codes that led nowhere, all referenced in the same flat, terse style, all undisturbed. He concluded again, never allowed that the Vatican had its own tradition of containment, not suppression, not exposure, but quiet stewardship of spiritual outliers, a kind of internal exhale. He was not the curator of a heresy. He was the custodian of a forgotten rhythm, the gentle beats of theological explorations that asked questions too large to file under certainty, but questions that still deserved to survive in the final months of his life. Giuseppe wrote in his Journal, a church that fears to listen will eventually forget how to speak. We must leave room, not for contradiction, but for contemplation. Not all truths are for the pulpit. Some are for the archive. He also scribbled a phrase he claimed had been found in the margins of LXE 9V, likely added centuries later by another anonymous hand. He who reads this must not teach, he must remember. The burden was never to spread the scroll's message. It was to keep it alive long enough for someone to wonder why it hadn't been destroyed. And maybe that is the most subtle kind of rebellion, not in voice or fire, but in refusal. The refusal to finish a sentence, the refusal to burn a thought, the refusal to say, this is not allowed. Instead, the archivist across the centuries said, this must be left alone, left alone. By the time Father Giuseppe Veltieri turned 82, he had stopped writing formal reports. His hands, once steady as a metronome, guiding the delicate fibers of vellum across his magnifying glass, had begun to tremble. But his mind remained clear, as did the quiet resolve that had kept a mysterious scroll, marked LXC9V, from the fire. The Vatican secret archives were shifting again, not structurally, but politically. A new prefect had been appointed, a Jesuit, charismatic, efficient, fond of modernization, digitization, and the occasional, thinly veiled reshuffling of policy. His name was Father Lucien Serra. He had a doctorate in archival theory and a warm, practiced smile. One morning, over tea in the archivist's cloister garden, Serra made a passing remark to Giuseppe. We are reviewing older holdings, especially those that have long been sealed. Some items, frankly, are curious clutter. They persist without context, no doctrine, no known authorship. You understand how these anomalies slow the pulse of the system? Giuseppe did not reply. He nodded, slowly, gently, as though acknowledging the weather. Not the warning. He knew what Sarah was talking about. He also knew that Sarah had not used the word tacitum. That, at least, was still hidden. But the subtle pressure had begun. Giuseppe recognized it. Not censorship that was too blunt, but what might be called archival hygiene, a quiet, clean trimming of the overgrowth. Scrolls without metadata, codices without known authors, items whose theological relevance was unclear. Terms like 60C9V. He began to prepare. Giuseppe knew his life was near its end. He had survived 3 bouts of pneumonia, 1 mild heart attack, and decades of bureaucratic overhaul. What he had not survived, and never would, was the slow corrosion of institutional memory, not intentional forgetting, procedural erosion, forms that required summaries, catalogs that preferred keywords, systems that made no room for things with no name. So he wrote a final letter, not to Sarah, not to any cardinal or theologian, but to the archives themselves, specifically to the future archivist who, like him, might one day be handed a scroll and told to erase it. The letter was filed without classification, without signature, and without an official seal. It was slipped between the covers of a bound volume of architectural surveys. Innocuous, forgotten, likely never to be touched. It was a letter meant for one reader only, someone who would know what to look for. The letter began like this: to the one who finds this, you are not the first, and you will not be the last. The scroll you hold has no doctrine. It issues no demands. It offers no challenge. It only remembers. And for that, it is considered dangerous. He continued, you may be tempted to read it, or to burn it. 10. It does not exist. But the greatest act of preservation is sometimes neither reading nor hiding, but simply not deciding. Keep it, not because it is sacred, but because it was spared. If you ask why it exists, remember, it was not written for the pulpit. It was written to be found. The letter ended with a sentence so faint it was nearly lost in the shadow of the binding. When memory dies, the church becomes an echo chamber of its own forgetting. That winter, Father Giuseppe passed away in his sleep. There was no fanfare, no funeral in St. Peter's, just a quiet mass said in the chapel of the archivists, tended by 8 colleagues and one curious janitor who had grown fond of the old priest's habit of humming Gregorian chants when alone in the stacks. His desk was cleared the following week. Father Sarah, now firmly in charge, initiated a reorganization of the holdings. An entire room of ambiguous acquisitions, things like anonymous letters, astrological calendars, fragments of liturgy with no source, was closed for reevaluation. It was during this cleanup that LXC9V vanished from its shelf. There was no record of removal, no log, no receipt, just a gap. Sarah, reportedly, was satisfied with the simplification. But someone had intervened. A few months later, a researcher from the Pontifical Gregorian University, a young laywoman with a specialization in medieval mysticism, was reviewing microfilm reels from the 1950s, searching for early Latin hymns. On reel number 2743, tucked between a scanned invoice, 4 pricks, and a list of penitent orders from Avignon, she found something odd. A page, handwritten, no title, no introduction. It began, he who reads this must not teach. He must remember. It continued with a passage describing a garden where truth arrives not in speech, but in stillness. The metaphors were strange. A river flowing backward, a door that could only be opened by forgetting your name. A light that could not be seen unless you closed your eyes. She printed the page. She asked a senior librarian if he recognized the text. He single quotes. He advised her to leave it alone. She didn't. She cited it in a footnote. In her thesis, the footnote read, anonymous passage, possibly from suppressed monastic source. Content reflects pre-doctrinal mystical imagery. Original. Location uncertain. Page marked. In archive copy number 2743, Vatican microfilm collection. That's all. No scandal, no discovery. Just a footnote, but the scroll, or at least a sliver of it, had survived. Not because it had been quoted, but because someone, somewhere, had decided that its silence deserved a trace. Years later, another archivist, a Jesuit named Matteo Spada, turned to the Architectural Survey, Volume 2, review floor plans of 17th century expansions. Inside, he found Giuseppe's letter. He read it 3 times. Then he placed it back. He said nothing, but a few days later, new shelf label appeared in the rear west corridor. It read, Tacitum. Beneath it, a locked drawer. No entry in the catalog. No identifying mark. Just a keyhole and an understanding. You might wonder, then, what was so dangerous about the scroll that only the Pope could read? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps it said something too obvious to be safe. That the divine does not arrive like thunder, but like memory. That truth is not declared. It is recalled. That God, too, might once have been a listener. And perhaps the scroll's danger was not in its content, but in its persistence. Because a thing that has no name, its number of author, no label, and still survives. That is a thing no system can control, and so it is left to the archivists, the silent guardians of the unsaid, to keep it safe, not by reading it, not by preaching it, but simply by remembering. Not to forget. The story doesn't begin in the Vatican. It begins in a dimly lit basement beneath a crumbling villa in northern Italy, once owned by the noble de Vescovi family. The year was 1976, and the estate had been emptied after the last heir passed away childless, his fortune long since consumed by legal battles, tax debts, and a few extravagant wine cellars. What remained of the family's possessions had been consigned to an auction house in Turin. Among them was Lot 47, a collection of what the catalog blandly described as ecclesiastical papers and miscellaneous vellum documents. No one paid much attention to Lot 47. It was listed between a chipped, Baroque holy water font and a carved reliquary missing its lid. There were no high bids, no gasps from the audience, no sense that history had just brushed past unnoticed. In fact, the entire lot sold for 18,000 lirabout. At the time, the buyer was not a scholar. He was an antique map dealer from Bologna named Arturo Grazzi. Arturo specialized in selling engraved maritime charts and travel documents to wealthy Americans looking to decorate their home libraries. He had little interest in ecclesiastical trivia, but he bought bulk lots when the price was low. A key, there's always something salvageable, he liked to say, even if it's just the leather bindings. Back in his shop, Arturo tossed the entire contents of Lot 47 into an old trunk labeled Latin Unsorted. The trunk sat untouched for nearly a decade. Then, in the spring of 1985, a graduate student named Donata Ferrero arrived at Arturo's shop on a cloudy Thursday morning. She was researching the paper trade in Renaissance Italy and had heard from a librarian in Bologna that Grazzi occasionally had interesting fragments. Arturo, half listening, waved her toward the trunk. "Take your time," he said. "Just don't spill the ink pot this time. Took a week to clean last time someone opened that thing." Donata knelt beside the trunk and opened the lid. The smell hit her first old ink, dried parchment, mildew, and beeswax. She smiled. For her, it was the smell of possibility. She began sifting through the papers. Most were what she expected: fragmented land deeds, portions of liturgical calendars, accounts of local tithes. She paused at a few items that bore red wax seals, but they had cracked and flaked with age. She gently set aside anything that bore the seal of the Holy Office. Those were usually drier than they sounded. Then she found it. It was wrapped in faded blue silk, secured with a knotted cord. The scroll was about 18 inches in length, slightly curved from decades of being bound. It bore no title, no author, no seal, but across the outside were 3 words written in Latin in a script so careful and narrow it seemed etched: Solum Pontifex Leger. Only the Pope may read. Donata blinked. She had never seen a restriction like that outside of canon law training. Documents. She glanced around. Arturo had disappeared into the back room, Clee fixing coffee. Donata untied the cord. The scroll was written in an elegant, cloying Latin, but not in the typical church style. The syntax was archaic. Some of the phrases bordered on poetic. It spoke of a voice in the Hall of Echoes, in a room beyond the litany of names, filled with those who wait without being counted. There were metaphors that made no sense, allusions that could not be traced. Donata recognized none of the quoted psalms, none of the doctrinal phrasing. It was either a forgery or something forgotten. Either way, it was not for sale, not in good conscience. She stood up, scroll in hand, and walked to the back. "Signor Grazzi," she called out. "This item where did it come from?" He shrugged. "Auction lot, Villa de Vescovi." "Why?" "It says it's restricted. May have come from the Vatican." Grazzi raised an eyebrow. "The Vatican doesn't sell," he said flatly. "They lose." They misplace, but they don't sell. Still, he took the scroll from her gently, with the kind of care he usually reserved for 16th century Venetian portolan. "Charts, want it?" he asked. "You've got the look of someone who will lose sleep otherwise." Donata hesitated. "I don't know if I should have it." Arturo nodded. Double quotes. "Well, then I'll keep it with the rest of the curiosities." We said, placing the scroll in a small drawer marked oddities. "But if you change your mind, make it soon. I've got an appraiser coming next month." What Donata didn't know, what Arturo didn't know, was that the de Vesovi family had once served as informal keepers of a Jesuit retreat library near Lake Orta, a remote property where suppressed or sensitive theological writings were sometimes deposited by cautious clergy in the 18th and 19th centuries. The property was abandoned after the Kingdom of Italy absorbed church holdings in the 1870s, and the library's contents were split, some sent back to Rome, others quietly tucked into noble family archives. Lot 47 had been a graveyard of forgotten voices. The scroll was real. It had likely been moved during the chaos of Napoleonic seizures, and over time, its provenance had been erased, leaving only those 3 words as a warning: "Only the Pope may read." Donata spent the next few weeks trying to trace any record of the scroll. She consulted ecclesiastical historians, Latinists, and even reached out anonymously to a Jesuit scholar in Milan. No one recognized the passage. One scholar even scoffed, saying, "Every decade, someone finds a lost gospel. It's always an allegory or a forgery." She returned to the shop. Arturo was out. A young assistant bored and reading a motorcycle catalog told her the scroll had been pulled for appraisal. "It might go to auction," he added. "Apparently, it's unusual. Someone in Rome asked about it." Donata's stomach dropped. She left her name, her number. She asked to be contacted before anything happened. She waited 2 days. On the 3rd morning, she received a call from Arturo. "Come quickly," he said. "You didn't hear this from me, but someone from the Vatican is coming tomorrow at night." Donata made a copy. She had taken photographs earlier, yes, but now she sat under a lamp in her apartment, copying the script by hand. She worked slowly, transcribing the entire text in a leather-bound notebook passed down from her grandfather. She translated each sentence as she went. The language was strange. The scroll described not sin, or grace, or judgment, but memory. It spoke of a time before doctrine, of voices that did not speak aloud. Knowledge passed not through instruction, but by absorption, like scent, or light, or silence. It described a great forgetting, after which the church would need scaffolds, rites, laws, structures, to prop up what had once flowed freely. It was not heresy. It wasn't anything, really, just different. The next morning, Arturo sold the scroll. He never told Donata who would come, only that they wore a black cassock, spoke perfect Italian, and paid in cash. No record, no receipt, only a nod. The scroll disappeared again, but the copy remained. Donata tucked it away, unsure of what to do. Years later, when she became a professor of early church literature at a small university in Liguria, she used parts of the translation in a lecture on poetic theology. No one noticed. The phrases slipped in like shadows among better-known passages, and once, in an interview with a religious magazine, she was asked about the most curious document she'd ever found. She smiled. "There was one scroll," she said, "that I wasn't supposed to read." She paused. "But sometimes, I think the point wasn't to read it. It was just to make sure it didn't vanish." And then she moved on, as if it were nothing, as if history hadn't just brushed your sleeve again. By the end of 1985, the scroll was gone, sold, reclaimed, perhaps incinerated. Donata Ferrero never learned which. God, but she had something more important than the parchment itself. She had a copy, not a reproduction in a museum, not a digitized scan archived in a public database. No, she had a slow, patient transcription made by her own hand, under her own breath, at a small kitchen table beside a window in Bologna. She didn't talk about it, not in public, not even to her colleagues, but she read it again and again, not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. In fact, what startled her most was how quiet the scroll was, not just in tone, but in posture. It didn't argue. It didn't instruct. It simply remembered. It described the loss of a kind of memory no one knew they'd lost. Not personal memory, not the recollection of a mother's voice or the streets of childhood, but some collective memory, something older than books, older than cathedrals. It used strange language, phrases like the light that comes before doctrine, the silence that precedes the altar, a name not spoken since the time of dust. Donato puzzled over these lines for months. They weren't poetry, but they weren't prose either. The scroll wasn't trying to be understood. It was trying to be preserved, and Donata understood that cute difference instinctively. That's why she made more copies. The first copy went to a friend in the Hebrew paleography department in Florence, someone with experience in decoding mystical language. She sent only a portion, stripped of context. A month later, he replied with a single line. This isn't Hebrew, but it reads like something written after forgetting how to pray. He said no more. The second copy was deposited anonymously into the rare books collection at her university. She forged a fictional provenance, fragment of late 15th century, allegorical liturgy, origin unknown. She used a false catalog number and left no metadata. No one noticed. It simply sat there, bound in a small red volume with other marginalia no one cared about. A third copy she mailed to a professor in Canada who studied heterodox Christian sects. This time she signed the note, an old friend, sharing an older question. She received no reply, just a stamped envelope 4 months later with the words, "Do not send more." Years passed. Donata moved apartments, then cities. She published 3 books, one on early Christian poetry, another on women mystics, and a quiet third volume titled Liturgy Without Echo, which no one bought, but which was whispered about in 1 or 2 circles of obscure theology. Students in the early 2000s. The scroll itself, whatever original had passed through the auction house, never surfaced again. But its copies began too, not in headlines, not in documentaries, but in footnotes, in conference papers, in passing. Latinist in Belgium referenced a previously unrecorded liturgical motif describing divine memory as breath. A mysticism scholar in Ireland cited an anonymous vellum fragment suggesting that the earliest rites were not spoken, but gestured. PhD thesis at a university in Prague contained an appendix titled Excerpts from the Memory Codex, Origin. Unknown, each trace was faint. Each time, the words shifted slightly. A line added here, a metaphor missing there, but always the same tone, always the same core idea, that before the structure, before the books, before the councils and corrections, there had been a way of knowing that required neither priest nor doctrine, something remembered without being taught. In 1998, Donata attended a symposium on suppressed theological texts in Geneva. During a break between sessions, a Jesuit priest approached her. He was young, soft-spoken, with the calm intensity of someone used to keeping secrets. "You're Professor Ferrero," he said. Not asked. She nodded, unsure. "I've read your third book," he continued. "Twice." She blinked. "Few people read that one," she said. "It's quite dull." He smiled. "Exactly." He paused, then lowered his voice. "May I ask, how many copies are there?" She stared at him. "What copies?" He smiled again, as if to say, "Good answer." But he continued. "The scroll, the real one, was never meant to be read. That's why it bore the restriction." solemn Pontifex Leger was not about authority. It was about insulation, protection. He leaned in. Some truths, when read too early, grow like mold. Not light, but shadow. Not revelation, but decay. Donata said nothing. The priest took a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. No return address, no expectation. It's just a thought. He nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Donata didn't open the envelope till she returned to her hotel. Inside was a single sentence. It's handwritten in Latin. The voice in the Hall of Echoes is not what we hear. It is what remains after we forget. Below it, a second line in Italian. Please stop copying it. She didn't, but she copied more carefully. Each new transcription bore slight variations. Some changed the order of lines. Others replaced metaphor with simpler phrasing. Still others inserted deliberate mistranslations. The core meaning remained, but the shape shifted, like water filling a different glass each time. It was her way of camouflaging it, not hiding it, but making it unattractive. By 2005, Donata had quietly seeded 7 altered versions into various monastic archives across Europe. She never told them what they were. She simply donated previously uncatalogued liturgical fragments under fake names, with forged acquisition notes and fabricated provincial diocesan seals. They were catalogued, scanned, shelved, mostly ignored, occasionally studied, and once, in 2013, one version was accidentally published in a digital theological journal as a speculative monastic meditation of unknown provenance. The scroll had become a ghost, not vanishing, just changing form. And so, in the end, what had almost been sold at auction for the cost of a bottle of wine became something else entirely. Not doctrine, not heresy, but a thread woven through shadows, footnotes, whispers, and questions. A thread that asked not what the church should teach, but what it had forgotten, and whether there was still anyone left willing to remember. Remember, when something disappears in history, it rarely vanishes in an instant. It tends to dissolve, drifting, dividing, losing edges until the original thing becomes unrecognizable. A legend, a whisper, a misfiled parchment at the bottom of a drawer. But sometimes, even in the quietest corners of human record keeping, the past has a way of protecting itself. By the late 2010s, Donata Ferrero was no longer a graduate student copying texts on a kitchen table. She was nearing retirement, known among the quiet ranks of Europe's historical theologians as something of a relic herself, never flashy, never prolific, but always precise. Her lectures were steady and unhurried. Her writing remained plain, even as fashions and academic language swelled with jargon. She published her last book in 2018. It was titled On the Memory of Silence, and it sold fewer than 500 copies. That suited her perfectly. She had no need for applause. She was simply keeping a promise no one else had made. What few people knew was that tucked inside a private folder in her home labeled Household Receipts was the final, full copy of the mysterious scroll. This was the purest one. Her hand copy of the original. The version she had written alone at her kitchen table with a fountain pen in 1985, lit by a single desk lamp. Over the years, it had faded slightly, but it was intact, and it was hers. It had never been shown to anyone, not fully donned until the day the letter arrived. It came in an ivory envelope, stamped from Rome. No return address, no seal dot, just a printed name at the top, Monsignor Riccardo Mazzoni, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Palazzo del Santo Fizzolo. Letter was brief. It did not threaten. It did not accuse. It merely humbly requested that Donata visit the Vatican Library in person to discuss a recent archival matter related to rare early theological fragments believed to have circulated in academic settings in the late 20th century. Donata sat with the letter for hours. She wasn't afraid. She was tired, but curiosity, that ancient, steady itch, still remained. So she went. The Vatican Library is not a place of drama. It is cool and dry, designed more for preservation than spectacle. The public imagines stained glass and chandeliers, but much of the real work happens under fluorescent bulbs, in cataloging rooms, in concrete vaults. It is a city of dust and silence. Donato was escorted to a small office with 2 chairs and a plain desk. Monsignor Mazzoni entered 10 minutes later. He was older than she expected, well into his 70s, but his movements were careful, deliberate, like someone who had spent decades measuring his gestures. He did not introduce himself with pomp. "Thank you for coming," said, gesturing for her to sit. On the table between them was a thin folder. Donata did not ask what was in it. She already knew. The Monsignor placed both hands on the folder. "This text," he began slowly, "is not forbidden. It is. It's unclassified." Donata raised an eyebrow. He continued, "There is no entry for it in the official indices. No recognized doctrine. No condemnation. It appears in no syllabus, no lecture, no letter of clarification. It simply is not mentioned." He paused. "There are some," he said, "who would prefer it stay that way." She nodded. "And you?" she asked. The Monsignor exhaled softly. A long silence passed between them. "I believe," he said, "that certain things resurface only when we have grown dull enough to need them again." He opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the scroll, not Donata's original hand copy, but one of the altered versions she had anonymously deposited in a Caramelite archive in Avignon. It bore her phrasing, her substitutions. She could tell immediately. Mazzoni continued, "I was a seminarian in the 1960s. There were whispers, even then, of a scroll lost, forbidden, or maybe never written. A liturgy before liturgy, a breath before the book. I thought it was myth." He tapped the page. "But I read this, and I remembered something I didn't know I had forgotten." Donata said nothing. He closed the folder. "I did not summon you here to ask for your original," he said. "I know you will not give it, and I would not take it, even if you did." Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a single slip of paper on the desk. It read, "If we forget how to speak, then we must learn how to listen to silence." He looked up. "That line," he said, "was found in the marginalia of a manuscript by Cardinal Bellarmine in 1601. It matches your scroll almost exactly, word for word." Donata's breath caught. He nodded. "The Vatican did not lose the scroll, Professor Ferrero. It simply let it drift until someone could read it properly." She looked at him carefully. "Is this permission?" she asked. Mazzoni shook his head. "It's not permission," he said. "It's a reminder." She left Rome with a copy of that slip in her notebook. Back home, she removed the original scroll from its folder. She read it aloud that night for the first time in decades. The words were soft, simple. They did not proclaim. They did not challenge. They simply named things, old names, forgotten ways of knowing, rituals that had no words, gestures that once meant something when language did not yet exist. And as she read, she understood something she never had before. The scroll wasn't written to be read. It was written to be remembered. In the years that followed, she too never published it, but she slipped more versions into quiet corners of the world. A rural monastery in Greece, an obscure Jesuit library in the Philippines, a burned-out Lutheran archive in Dresden, where she donated it under the pretense of comparative liturgical studies. And always, the phrasing changed slightly, never identical, but always familiar. The Vatican never contacted her again. The scroll was no longer a single thing. It had become what it always had been, a question scattered through time. Not what is truth, but rather, what have we forgotten so completely that we no longer know we've lost it? That question, boring, unanswerable, slow as dust, is what kept the scroll alive. It is, perhaps, what keeps all memory alive. Not ceremony, not repetition, but the simple act of wondering. And now, somewhere perhaps in a drawer in Avignon, or the back room of a rural school chapel in Portugal, or tucked between other donations in a university basement in Wisconsin, there is a version of the scroll waiting to be read, or ignored, or miscatalogued. It does not mind, because its only purpose is to linger, quietly, until someone, maybe you, stumbles across it and remembers something you didn't know you'd forgotten. You'll need to squint to find the name. The Order of the Little Hours of Silence was never large, never popular, never mentioned in textbooks. At its peak, it had 3 monasteries, all in central Italy, and never more than 75 monks across all 3. Their robes were brown, their sandals were cheap. Their rule was unremarkable, save for one point: they did not speak. It wasn't a vow of silence, exactly. It was something older, a habit of muteness, passed down not as a law, but as a rhythm. You see, these monks did not believe that silence was holy. They believed it was useful for noticing what the soul was doing when no one was asking it questions, for listening to thoughts before they had words, for hearing God in the clink of a spoon or the squeak of old wood. Their liturgy was breath and gesture. They memorized entire masses by movement alone. When they needed to signal something, practical food, illness, visitors, they used their fingers or pieces of cloth or a carved wooden token passed hand to hand. No bells, no clocks, just shadow and motion. One of these monasteries sat on a high ridge above the Umbrian Valley, wrapped in olive trees and encircled by low, crumbling stone walls. The structure was older than the order itself, built atop an abandoned hermitage, which had been built atop a Roman granary, which had been built, perhaps, atop a burial mound of some forgotten tribe. It was here, in the summer of 1762, that a letter arrived, not by horse, not by carriage, not even by PayPal courier. The letter came folded in a linen pouch, tied with a strip of waxed cord, quite laced under a stone at the far edge of the garden path where the monks collected their herbs. It was addressed, in a firm Latin script, to no one, to the abbot or the one who remembers why we are quiet. Brother Luco was the one who found it. He was not an abbot, not even a senior monk. He was 36, awkward with tools, prone to headaches in the sun. He had joined the Order 12 years prior, after a minor scandal involving a local bishop's niece and a misunderstanding at a vineyard. Since then, he had embraced the silence with more sincerity than skill. He often forgot the proper gestures. He prayed with his mouth slightly open, as if always halfway to an apology. But he listened. He watched, and the others had grown too. Respect him for that. He opened the letter privately. This was not procedure. Technically, any message was to be shown first to the prior, who would decide whether it warranted translation into signs for the community. But the letter had no mark of origin, no seal, no sender, just those 12 strange words: to the abbot, or the one who remembers why we are quiet. Luco took the pouch to his cell, unknotted the cord, and unfolded the page. What he saw made no sense. Not at first. The handwriting was clear Latin again, but it seemed to loop back on itself. The sentences folded inward, repeating words, but shifting their order. Phrases returned like refrains in a chant, but without conclusion. There were no instructions, no names, just a series of statements that felt like memories someone had written down before they evaporated. We did not speak at first because the stones were listening. Silence was not for prayer, but for protection. We forgot the name, but we remember the shape of the sound. If you read this, the line is broken. Speak only if you must repair. Luco blinked. The parchment was older than the pouch, older than the wax, but not ancient. Perhaps a century, maybe 2. The ink was faded, brown in some places. The folds were soft, as if the page had been opened and closed many times. He read it again. Okay. Then a third time, something stirred in his chest. Not fear, not wonder, recognition, as if these were not new words, but old ones he had once known in a different form. He said nothing. Not for a day. Not for a week. He kept the letter under a sleeping mat, rereading it by candlelight each night, memorizing its strange refrains. He began to notice things. A pattern in the way Brother Tomas placed the loaves in the warming basket. A flicker of hesitation in the prior's eyes each time they passed the empty cell at the end of the north wing. A carved symbol on the underside of the chapel's altar he raised, shaped like a curled ear. And then at dusk, one afternoon, he heard something. A sound, not a voice, not music, a pressure, a low thrum in the air. Just before the Vespers candle was lit, it came from the walls, or maybe behind them. Luco did not sleep that night. He walked the perimeter of the monastery in his bare feet. He touched each doorframe, each window latch, each place where the stone had cracked and been repaired. He climbed into the attic and opened the slats to the evening air. He descended into the dry well near the herb garden. In each place, he listened, not for answers, not even for clarity, just for proof that the silence was not empty. At dawn, he returned to his cell. He removed the letter. He folded it carefully. He placed it into the fire. He did not burn it. Instead, he waited until the embers cooled and buried it, ash and all, beneath the stone where he had found it. Then he returned to his duties, as if nothing had changed. But others noticed Brother Mateo, who washed the vestments, saw that Luco now crossed himself differently, palm-open fingers, curled inward. Brother Raphael, who tracked the prayer rotations, observed that Luco had shifted his hour from midnight to 3 a.m., the hour once known in the order as hora mortua, the hour of the dead. And the prior, who had served for 30 years and thought he had forgotten everything strange about their way of life, found himself waking at night with the sensation that someone was humming in the garden. No one confronted Luca, not directly, but they began to watch him. And when, 3 months later, a second letter arrived placed under the same stone, sealed with wax that bore no sigillate, was Luco, they all looked too, silently, as if to say, "You found the first dot, now find the meaning." He took the second letter into the chapel. He unsealed it with a wooden blade. He did not read it. He simply placed it on the altar and waited, not in prayer, not in defiance, but in stillness. And in that moment, before sunrise, before the clanging of pans, before the birds even began to stir, he felt the silence return. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper, the quiet that had once existed. Before the first vow had been uttered, the quiet the letter had spoken of, the quiet the monks had somehow begun to forget. And so the order changed, subtly, without decision, without meeting. The monks began to sleep in different shifts. The prayers grew shorter. The gestures became simpler. They stopped repairing the broken sundial. They let the weeds overtake the cloister's walk, and in place of structure came rhythm. They did not speak more, but they heard more, felt more, remembered more. And somewhere, though none of them admitted it, they all came to know what Luco had read in the first letter. That silence had not always been about God. Sometimes it was about survival, because someone or something had once been listening, and maybe still was. The third letter was never found, but the prior once said, shortly before his death, that he dreamed of a fourth. One that simply read, "You can speak now, we're not listening anymore." The monastery's records never mention the letters. That's not unusual. Monastic archives, particularly in the 18th century, often omitted personal or mystical events. Their purpose was administrative, not emotional. They noted repairs to roof tiles, shipments of barley, ordinations, deaths, but they did not mention what kept the monks awake at night, or the reason. A certain corridor was avoided after Complaine, so the letters vanished from formal history before they ever arrived. What remains, however, is this. In the summer of 1763, the Order of the Little Hours of Silence abruptly stopped sending quarterly reports to the bishopric of Perugia. No explanation, no complaints, no scandal, just silence. The bishop at the time, Giovanni Altieri, a cautious and pragmatic man, sent to clerks to inquire. They returned with a curious report. The monks were in good health. The grounds were well maintained. No heresies, no disturbances. But when asked why they had ceased communication, the monks offered no response. They simply pointed to a wooden board nailed to the inside of their main gate. Carved into the wood were 6 words in Latin: non oblivio, sed memoria per silentium. Not forgetfulness, but memory through silence. The bishop, finding no violation of doctrines, dropped the matter, but the message spread quietly. Other orders heard of it: Dominicans in Spalato, the Camaldolese further south, even the Benedictines in Monte Cassino. Each interpreted the phrase differently. Some saw it as a subtle protest against Rome's growing bureaucracy. Others thought it a warning of something darker, apocalyptic even. But to the monks, it was not a declaration. It was a reminder. Brother Luco, by this time, had assumed a strange position within the monastery. He was not prior. Yet he was consulted before every deviation in ritual. He held no office, yet every brother deferred to him when decisions arose. He had spoken aloud only 3 words uttered during a solitary vigil when a younger monk collapsed from exhaustion. No one recorded what he said. No one needed to. The boy recovered the next day. Lucio resumed his silence, but the others began to follow him in ways that could not be explained by rank. They mirrored the way he paused before passing through certain doorways. They waited beside him when he stood, motionless, near the old well, and they began copying, by hand, snippets of what they believed had been in the original letters, not the words. Those were lost, but impressions, fragments. They etched curved lines on parchment, strange spirals, circles within circles, shapes that resembled musical notation, but offered no melody. They drew them not with the intent to understand, but to remember, as if remembering a shape might preserve its meaning even after the sound had gone. The 3rd letter never arrived, but something else did. In October of 1763, during the feast of St. Francis, a visitor arrived at the monastery's gate. She was barefoot, elderly, wrapped in wool. Her face was sun-dried, wrinkled like a walnut, and her eyes were pale from cataracts. She carried no bag, no food, no walking stick, just a square parcel wrapped in oilcloth. When Brother Tomas opened the gate, she said nothing. She handed him the parcel, bowed her head, and turned back down the path. She disappeared into the trees. Inside, the parcel was a book, not printed, handwritten, not titled, not signed. Its cover bore no decoration except a single mark pressed into the leather rough spiral, crudely inked with what looked like a sharpened reed. The pages inside were covered with writing, land, Greek, a little Hebrew, some Aramaic, but most of the script was in no recognizable language, not code, not cipher, something else, almost as if it had been written to sound like language without being bound by meaning. The monks stared at it in shifts, some for hours, others for days. Brother Matteo fasted for 3 days and nights and claimed to see the letters move. Brother Franco traced the spiral on the cover every morning before dawn and later carved the same shape into the underside of his cot. Luco, meanwhile, refused to open the book after its first reading. He said nothing, of course, but he kept it wrapped and placed it in the alcove behind the chapel, neath a loose stone where the first letter had been buried. The rest of the community let it be, not because they feared it, but because they understood by then that the most important things are not always to be read. They are to be remembered without explanation. In early winter, a windstorm knocked loose one of the monastery's upper shutters. Behind the panel, we found a hollow space, and inside that hollow, wrapped in cloth, was another letter. But this one was not addressed to the monks. It was from them, dated 1457, written in the same looping, chant-like Latin. When they come to ask why we are quiet, tell them, we speak, but not with breath. We are keeping the name safe, because once it is spoken, the world will end not in fire, but in knowing. Below the message was the same spiral symbol, fainter, less confident, but undeniably the same. None of the living monks had known it was there, which meant the silence they now practiced was not something they had invented or revived. It had always been part of the place. The spiral, the remembering, the idea that some knowledge can only survive if it is never spoken aloud. By spring, the monastery had changed. More monks arrived, drawn by rumor, by accident, by instinct. They were not turned away. They were shown no books. They were simply given a cell and a space to walk. Some stayed a week, some stayed for life. A few claimed to have dreamt of the place before they arrived. One said he had seen the spiral drawn in frost on a window in Naples. Another said his grandmother had spoken of a hill where the world kept its breath. Luco never responded to their stories. He simply nodded. That seemed to be enough. In 1771, the bishopric finally struck the monastery from its registry. It was not excommunicated, simply forgotten. No taxes were collected, no visitations made. On paper, the place ceased to exist. The monks continued, unchanged, but the letters, the real ones, were no longer kept in their cells. They were passed quietly, left under tree roots, buried with the bones of dead brothers, folded into the linings of traveling cloaks for monks, sent on pilgrimage, never catalogued, never burned, only remembered and rewritten in whatever form memory allowed. Centuries passed. The monastery was abandoned during Napoleon's campaigns, briefly reclaimed in the 1800s by a band of rural mystics. It later used as a hideout during the Second World. Each group left its mark: carvings, candles, scribbled notes in the margins of psalters. But the silence remained, and so did the spiral, scratched into stone, etched onto doors, drawn in the dust of old floorboards. The letters were never recovered. The names of the monks mostly lost, but a few visitors, scholars, hikers have reported strange dreams after passing through the site. Dreams where they hear a voice say nothing, and yet feel, unmistakably, that something has been said. And so we ask, was the scroll real? Were the letters sent by someone? Or something? Or were they born from silence itself, evolving within the minds of men who needed stillness to survive? If a message is never spoken, but its shape remains carved in habit, in ritual, in pause, did it ever need to be written at all? Centuries later, the silence cracked, but only slightly. In the spring of 1954, a mid-level Vatican archivist named Father Pietro Fabri was assigned to catalog and photograph neglected diocesan records from the Umbrian region. He was a quiet man, trained in the methodical arts of ink analysis and parchment dating. He had no interest in conspiracy, no appetite for folklore, but he loved forgotten things, forgotten treaties, forgotten protocols, for obscure rural orders. One afternoon, while leafing through an unindexed bundle of 18th century reports from the Diocese of Perugia, Father Fabri noticed something odd. Tucked inside a tax register was a page from a different hand. It was not labeled. It was not listed, but it was there. The page bore no heading, only a single line in tight, clean Latin script on the monks who remember through silence beneath it. Someone, perhaps a bishop's secretary or an inquisitive cleric, had penned a strange, cautious narrative. It described a visit to a monastery of mute brethren located near the old ridge above Assisi. The monastery's name was not given, nor was the author's, but the description matched perfectly with the order of the little hours of silence. The author noted that the monks communicated with hand gestures and tokens, avoided contact with outsiders, and claimed to have inherited a guardianship of sound. Father Fabry paused. The phrase didn't match any known theological doctrine, nor did it appear in canon law or in the rituals of other silent orders. He checked old glossaries. Nothing. He read further. The document described the visit of an unnamed PayPal agent in 1766. This man, cading under orders from a cardinal with connections to the Vatican library, had gone to observe the monks and determine whether their practices were heretical or merely eccentric. He brought with him a letter's contents, not specified, and attempted to read it aloud, and the monks, refectory, the document, noted, upon the second word, a lantern, shattered. No wind, no movement, just glass and silence. The agent left, the letter on the altar. He did not retrieve it. 2 weeks later, he reportedly renounced speech entirely and joined a small Carthusian retreat near Nogni. His name was never recorded again. Father Fabry felt a familiar pull. He'd experienced it before once with a marginal note in a 13th century charter, another time with a faint watermark that led to the rediscovery of a missing episcopal seal, the feeling that something large was buried beneath, something small. So he filed a request with the Vatican's Subsecretariat for Monastic History. The request was simple. Locate any prior references to silent monastic orders in Umbria, PRE 1700, cross-reference with unauthorized liturgies, unsealed correspondences, or oddities in the registry of vows. It took 4 months for the reply to arrive. Just one entry, a side note from 1592, written in Latin. On the margin of a vellum-bound volume of regional visitation reports, a hermit priest claims a monastery of the quiet hills keeps the spiral word, and none may speak it, lest they wake the listeners. It was written in red ink, initialed only with epipha. Fabry's curiosity darkened into quiet obsession. He requested travel approval to visit the remnants of the monastery. It took some convincing, but eventually he was granted a 10-day research leave with a small camera, a copy of the 18th century document, and a notebook bound in soft leather. He traveled to Umbria and hired a local guide to take him to the ruins. They found them easily. The site had been overgrown with olive trees and creeping grass, but the foundation remained intact. The outer wall, low and crumbling, still enclosed a rectangular cloister. The Ticklesals had partial roofs. The chapel was roofless, but the altar was untouched, made of solid stone, scarred but unbroken. He spent 3 days there, measuring, photographing, listening. It was on the 4th night, while sleeping under the stars near the chapel, that he dreamt of the spiral. It was not a vision, not a revelation, just a slow, circling movement, like a finger turning endlessly through water in the dream. He was reading a letter. He could not see the words, but he could feel them vibrating behind his ribs. Each word seemed to reshape his bones. He awoke, gasping. In the morning, he found it. Not a letter, not a book, but a shallow etching beneath the altar, carved into the stone, almost invisible unless light struck it at just the right angle. A spiral, 3 turns, no beginning, no end. He copied it into his notebook, took a photograph, and returned to Rome. He never published, not out of fear, nor because of Vatican censure, but because he couldn't explain it. Each time he tried to write a report, he found his sentences looping, not in error, but in rhythm, as if the thing he'd found was infecting his grammar. He abandoned the report, instead tucked the copied spiral into a folder marked in Nexum Silentio Appendix of Silence and quietly placed it in an unindexed drawer in the archives. He died in 1981, childless, retired, unremarked, but 2 years after his death, a junior archivist sorting Vatican backlog found his folder, and then something strange happened. The archivist, a young Belgian named Mark Vervoort, began sending letters, not to colleagues, not to family, to monasteries, silent ones, Benedictines, Carthusians, Camaldolese, all across Europe. Each letter contained a drawing of the spiral. No explanation, just the image. Some monasteries returned the letters. Some never replied, but one near abandoned hermitage in northern Portugal sent back a page. It was covered in symbols. Some matched the spiral, some didn't, but one phrase stood out, not written, into the paper as if pressed by a blunt stylus. It is not a word. It is a habit, a shape of thought that must never become sound. Mark Vervoort placed this page into the Vatican's informal archive of curiosities and resigned the following year. He was never heard from again. Today, the monastery in Umbria is a shell. Tourists sometimes visit, mostly hikers. They take photos, admire the view, read a few plaques installed by local historians. The plaques mention the monks' vow of silence, their herbal gardens, their unusual prayer schedule, but they do not mention the letters. They do not mention the spiral or the sound. No, one is allowed to speak. So now, centuries later, we return to the question, what was in the letter? What did it say? Why did it come without a sender? Why was it left in silence and buried in ash? Perhaps it was not meant to be understood, only carried, like a rhythm in the chest, like a song hummed, just below hearing, like a memory you never made, but somehow remember? And maybe that's the point. Not to read it, not to say it, but to keep it safe by never opening the mouth. Because the most dangerous knowledge is not the kind that harms the body. It's the kind that teaches the soul what it was never meant to know aloud. It began with a list, not a prophecy, not a curse. It's just a plain bureaucratic inventory in the year 1559, amid the pale stone corridors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, then known simply as the Archive. A clerk named Girolamo Santi was assigned an ordinary task. He was to audit a collection of unopened scrolls transferred from the library of the Lateran Palace. The scrolls were thought to be part of the spoils relocated during the reign of Pope Paul IV, when books and documents deemed sensitive were quietly removed from churches and monasteries and brought under the direct eye of the Curia. There were hundreds of such scrolls. Many were indecipherable. Some were mold-eaten. Few were sealed with wax marks from long-dead abbots and bishops. They were stored in a side chamber barely lit, rarely entered. Its air thick with dust and long decayed. Vellum. Santi was a man of habit. He catalogued with precision, always in triplicate. He wrote in quiet ink, careful not to spell, careful not to speculate. And yet, one item caught his eye. Scroll number XCII, wrapped not in leather, but in cloth, dark cloth, not faded dark, by design. Like a funeral shroud, the string binding, it was not twine or wax ribbon, but a strip of dried reed, twisted tightly and looped 3 times. No label, no signature, only a slip of parchment inside the cloth, folded once with 4 words, Pontificis, Oculi Tantum. For the eyes of the Pope only. Santi hesitated. This was not rare. Some documents were indeed intended for PayPal eyes alone correspondence from kings, sealed bulla of excommunication, or drafts of controversial theological arguments. But those were almost always cataloged, coded, and referenced somewhere in the archives. Vast ledgers. This one was not. It had no origin, no mention. It did not exist. And so, Santi wrote nothing, not a word, not even a private note. He placed the scroll back in its shroud, wound the reed tight, and set it aside in a small wooden coffin marked unsealed, then slid the box behind a wall of lesser scrolls. He said nothing to his supervisor. He completed the rest of his inventory. He handed in his triplicate report. He never returned to the archives again. Santi's name appears in no further archival records after August 1559. Some said he had fallen ill. Others said he had joined the Dominicans in Anagni I. Rumor mentioned in the private journal of a minor Jesuit. Official claimed that Santi had been transferred by silence, a euphemism occasionally used to describe those relocated under papal authority with no official paper trail. In truth, no one knows. His apartment in Rome was vacated, his possessions dispersed, but in the lining of his cloak now, held in the Vatican's textile collection, was stitched a single phrase: Noli operaire, memenus satis est. Do not open it, To remember is enough. The scroll remained hidden for 43 years, until 1602. That year, a new archivist named Francesco Di Maria began a full inventory of misplaced or orphaned materials in the Archivum. The Vatican had recently increased its emphasis on proper categorization following a series of diplomatic incidents involving misplaced letters from the French crown. Di Maria, methodical and unflinching, cataloged hundreds of rogue documents. One morning, as he pulled down a bundle of minor papal decrees regarding church repairs in Malta, the small coffer slid forward and fell at his feet. He opened it. Inside, the cloth-bound scroll, still dark, still tightly wound with reed, a note, remained Pontifices Oculi Tantum. But Di Maria had something Santi had not access. He had been granted full clearance for sensitive ecclesiastical records, a special designation given to scholars trusted with documents of theological controversy, usually heresies forbidden, texts or mystical experiences claimed by saints and later deemed unverified. So he broke the reed and unwrapped the scroll. What he found did not frighten him at first. It was short, only a few lines, penned in a hand that looked ancient, told her. Then the parchment, perhaps even copied from another source. It was not a message, not a command, not a vision. It was a name, written once, underlined twice. Then, below it, sentence: Hoc est nomen quod non diciter, nisi in tempore silenti finalis. This is the name that shall not be spoken, except in the final silence. The name was Indecipherable. It was not Latin, it was not Greek. It resembled no known script, a line of curling characters, looping over one another like waves in a pool of oil. But when Di Maria looked at it too long, felt something odd, not fear, not awe, something like vertigo, as if the letters were not just symbols, but openings. He wrapped the scroll again, sealed the coffer, and placed it in the archive's restricted unknowns cabinet. But from that day on, he began to speak more slowly. He paused before certain words. He refused to read scripture aloud, even during communal prayer. And when asked about the scroll, he simply said, "It is not ours to speak." By the late 1600s, the scroll had become a whispered legend within the archives. A few clerks called it the name that ends all names. Others simply referred to it as the papal scroll, not because it was written by a pope, but because only the pope was allowed to read it. A rule no one had enforced, and yet, somehow, everyone obeyed. In 1711, a young archivist named Paolo Bernini attempted to transcribe it. He lasted 2 days. On the morning of the third, he locked himself in the archive's side chapel and burned his notes. He emerged an hour later and requested transfer to the apostolic penitentiary. He took a vow of perpetual silence. His reasons were never written. The scroll was sealed again. In 1743, during the archival reforms of Pope Benedict XIV, it was placed in a bronze case, wrapped in lead and labeled with a red wax stamp marked Sub Secreto Perpetuo, under permanent secrecy. It remains there still, inside the secret archives, which, ironically, are no longer secret. Since 2019, they've been renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, and some materials have been declassified. But not the scroll. It's still there, still unread, still shrouded, still bearing that phrase. Pontifices oculi tantum. Modern scholars have speculated endlessly. Some believe it contains the real name of God. It's speculated in early apocryphal texts, too powerful to speak, too sacred to write. Others suggest it's a relic of early Christian mysticism, perhaps Gnostic. Perhaps it's seen preserved accidentally through centuries of transcription. A few have argued that the scroll is a fraud, a monk's personal riddle elevated into mystery by centuries of silence. But others point to the pattern. Everyone who has read it, truly read it, left. The archives changed. They spoke less. They wrote less. They sought out silence, not to hide, but to protect. So what could be written in a scroll, so dangerous, so sacred that even the Pope must approach it with hesitation? What name curls across its surface like oil on stone? And why has no one in 500 years dared to transcribe it? Perhaps the danger is not in the scroll. Perhaps it's in the reader, because sometimes the most powerful truths aren't the ones that shatter the world. They're the ones that remind us it's already breaking. The scroll might have remained undisturbed, just another whispered anomaly, buried beneath layers of papal decrees and forgotten inventories. Were it not for the reign of Pope Pius VIII, his papacy was short, very short. He was elected in March of 1829 and died in November of 1830. Just over a year. It's a flash in the long procession of pontiffs. But during those 17 months, something unusual occurred. Something quiet. Something still left unexplained. It began with a directive, one that has puzzled scholars for generations. On June 14th, 1830, in the early morning hours, Pope Pius VIII summoned a small group of archivists and Monsignori to the Torre de Ventida, tower of the Winzan astronomical chamber within the Vatican, often used for secretive discussions. Away from the usual corridors of power. Present were Monsignor Luigi Giretti, assistant to the Apostolic Penitentiary, archivist Don Marco Gentile, specialist in apocryphal theology Cardinal Stefano Rivera, prefect of the congregation. For the doctrine of the faith, 2 guards from the Noble Guard, names unrecorded. The purpose, to retrieve a document from the secret archives, specifically, from a drawer labeled Sub Secreto Perpetuo, the scroll. The Pope had found mention of it in a marginal note in the Book of Hours, kept by one of his predecessors. Pope Clement XIII was just a passing reference, scribbled in pale ink, of the scroll whose name cannot be known aloud. Pray. The successors never speak it. That was all, but it had lodged itself in the Pope's mind. He had grown obsessed with it, not in a conspiratorial way, but in a deeply personal, almost mournful way. As if amidst the political turbulence of post-Napoleonic Europe, amidst the fading influence of the papacy, he had begun to believe that some truth solder than Rome, deeper than dogma, had been hidden away, and now whispered for release. The scroll was brought to him in a plain lead container, wrapped in black cloth, tied once again with dried reed. It had not been unwrapped in nearly 90 years. The Pope did not open it. At first, he prayed. For hours, he sat alone in the papal chapel, hands folded, the scroll on the altar. Witnesses later noted that he refused food, refused water, kept a candle burning beside him, though the chapel was already lit by tall windows in the midday sun. Then, finally, on the evening of June 15th, he unwrapped it. No one else was present. No record remains of what he saw. But afterward, according to a brief account, quoted by Monsignor Torretti, the Pope said only this: "There is a word not made for speech, in a silence that is louder than thunder." The next morning, he issued a sealed order that the scroll be resealed, recatalogued, and moved to the Archive Minimum, an inner chamber of the archives used for documents that were neither banned nor approved just unsettled. Then he issued another order. "Let it be known that no tongue may form that name again, not even mine." He never spoke of the scroll again, but his behavior changed. He grew stiller. He no longer gave public addresses. He stopped issuing encyclicals. Instead, he wrote only brief, cryptic reflections notes in the margins of older papal decrees, annotations on theological treatises that hadn't been read in decades. One of these notes, scribbled in the margin of a 14th century translation of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, reads, "There is speech that builds the church, and there is speech that unmakes creation." Another, beside a commentary on the book of Revelation. Perhaps the seal was never meant to be broken, but perhaps it already was before we knew what a seal was. He died 5 months later. His cause of death, natural complications, following inflammation of the stomach. But those who saw his body said his face had changed, not with pain, not with age, but with restraint, as if he had spent the last days of his life holding something back, not a secret, but a word, a single word, too heavy to release, too sacred to forget. For decades, his behavior was attributed to illness, stress, or quiet piety, but those close to him knew better. Cardinal Riverla, shortly before his own death, wrote a private letter to the archivist Don Marco Gentile. It was never sent, but found among his personal papers. In it, he wrote, "The scroll is not dangerous because of what it contains. It is dangerous because of what it remembers in us. Something older than empire, older than the church. Silence, so deep that when you touch it, you forget the world was ever noisy." So what was the scroll? Why was it written? Who wrote it? And why, in the century since, has it never been destroyed? Because it could be. With one match, one flame. It could vanish, but it hasn't. It has been hidden. Yes, locked, renamed, buried, in bureaucracy, but never burned, never lost, never erased. Even now, in the 21st century, it exists. A catalog entry, redacted in all public indices. A scroll wrapped in dark cloth, placed within a sealed vault beneath the Apostolic Palace, accessible only with triple papal authorization. Not because the scroll holds its power, but because it reflects something within the reader, something unrepeatable, something that does not belong in words. In the Vatican Museum's Codex Rome, it's a faded letter from the 10th century. It's unsigned, addressed to no one, and likely never sent, but it contains a strange phrase. There are letters that write us back, and names that echo longer than stone. The scroll is one such name, unwritten by human hand, unreadable by normal eyes, but present in the silence between bells, in the pause before speech, in the long breath that comes before revelation. So, what did Pope Pius VIII see? Did he recognize the word? Did he understand the shape of his letters? Or was it like a mirror, not showing his reflection, but something deeper? The silence beneath his thoughts, the root before the root, the name behind all names. Perhaps it is better left unread, not out of fear, but reverence, because the holiest, Things are not always the loudest thoughts sometimes. They are the things we dare not speak, not because we are forbidden, but because, deep down, we understand that to say them would undo something sacred, something that must remain whole. You are standing, now, in the past, but in the whispering present. The Vatican's Apostolic Archive, with its tall stone corridors and dust-blown shelves, remains quiet even on the busiest days. Behind its thick wooden doors and under the cool hush of centuries-old vaulted ceilings, time feels unhurried. Fluorescent lights hum faintly over tables stacked with parchment-bound ledgers, and footsteps echo gently on cold terrazzo floors. But deep beneath all this, under the east wing, where few are ever permitted to enter, is a vault that most archivists only know. My legend, the vault is not labeled on the official floor plans. Its code is not kept in any digital index. Its contents are known only to 3 men at any given time. The archivist appointed by the Pope, the cardinal custodian of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, even though that index is no longer in use, and the Pope himself, inside, kept in a climate-controlled brass case lined with velvet. It's a single scroll, cloth-wrapped, reed-bound, the one we followed across centuries, across rumors and PayPal silences, the one no one ever speaks of directly. And while you can't see it, you can imagine it. There is no magic here, no conspiracy. It's only the strange weight of something that refuses to disappear. Over the last 2 centuries, many have tried to investigate the scroll, not through direct access. Of course, only the Pope may view it, but through the records surrounding it. The trail is thin, often encoded, often buried in margins, but every few decades, someone touches the edges of the mystery. In 1926, an Italian Jesuit scholar named Angelo Di Martino compiled what was then the most extensive index of unnamed documents in the Vatican's custody. Among the 1,200 entries he listed, one stood out. It was referred to only as Documento Senza Voce, the voiceless document. He never cited it directly, only listed its case number when he was asked about it in a private letter by a German academic. His reply was short: "We are not the keepers of every mystery. Sometimes we are the kept." Di Martino retired early. He lived in silence in a small monastery outside Genoa until his death in 1953. He never wrote again. Then came 1962. The Second Vatican Council was underway. It was a moment of dramatic modernization in the Church, updating liturgy, engaging with modern science, and opening windows. As Pope John the 23rd famously said, to let in fresh air. But in the background of all this light and renewal was a strange footnote in an internal document drafted by Cardinal B on ecumenical dialogue. It mentioned, almost cryptically, in certain matters, long kept in darkness by tradition, rather than doctrines, which may yet breathe when the seal is lifted. Most ignored it, but a few noticed. That same year, a young Polish bishop attending the council requested access to sealed apocryphal materials for his theological thesis. His name was Karol Wojtyła. He would later become Pope John Paul II. His request was denied, but during his papacy, decades later, he would quietly reassign the scroll from the archive in minimum to an even smaller vault beneath the private papal apartments. No explanation was given. No public record was made. Only a new slip of parchment was added to its case. Let it be buried in time, not to hide it, but to give it rest. The scroll had been written, read, rewrapped, and hidden for centuries. And yet, despite all this, it had never made its way into any official catalog of sacred texts. It had no doctrinal value, no citation in canon law. It was not heretical, not forbidden, not classified as mystical, liturgical, or blasphemous. It simply ... It existed, and no one quite knew why, except perhaps those who had read it, and even they never explained. There is something profoundly human in the instinct to protect what we do not understand, not out of fear, not out of reverence, okay, but out of a kind of ancestral caution and echo from older, quieter times. A sense that some knowledge, some names, are not meant to be shared, not because they are dangerous, but because they are deeply, quietly unrepeatable, like the first breath of a newborn dot or the last word of a dying man. These are not things you echo. They belong to a singular moment, and the scroll, for all its mystery, seemed to speak in that same language. One word. UNTRANSLATED. UNTRANSLATABLE. A name, not for utterance, but for recognition. A recent interview with an anonymous Vatican archivist broadcast quietly in a podcast for Religious Historical Society hinted that, even now, the scroll is checked once a decade, not read, not studied, confirmed, wrapped, untouched, still there. When the archivist was asked why such care was still taken for a document no one used, he paused before answering, because some silences are part of the church too. It's not the loud ones that ring from cathedrals, the old ones, the ones we inherited but can't explain. You don't break a silence like that. You tend it, like a candle in a sealed room. So what do we make of this? Was the scroll ever meant to be seen? Was it a test? A relic of a lost tradition? Could it have been nothing more than a monk's private meditation, mistaken over centuries for something sacred? Or was it truly what some hinted at? A name. One that doesn't belong to any language, but which all languages once circled around. A name that doesn't reveal power, but undoes the illusion of it. A name that doesn't destroy the world, but reminds us that we never owned it to begin with. Maybe that's why the scroll survives. Not because it's protected, but because it's resisting. It doesn't want to be. Read again. It has done its work. Its word was spoken once, and now the church listens not to what it says, but to what it stopped. You don't need to believe in magic to find meaning in this. Every generation has its unread scrolls, stories we refuse to look at, truths we wrap in layers of cloth, tuck behind theologies, and bury beneath the noise of modernity. Not to hide, but to wait, to be remembered, not in words, but in the careful act of not speaking them. Somewhere in the Vatican today, that scroll remains wrapped, unopened, no label, no warning, no prophecy, just a silence. 500 years long, and a name not forgotten, just left where it's. Because sometimes, what's most sacred isn't what we say, it's what we choose not to say.